Thank you.
All
And
right.
I'm happy to be here and welcome to you all. Obviously, this is a special sort of, obviously, this is a special sort of institution, and that makes, for me anyway, anything that we do the right thing. And that is an unusual situation in my life anyway. I'm always most interested in what I'm doing at the moment. That's a wonderful book. It's worth reading, and there's some great stories in it. And probably most of you haven't, maybe you read some of the stories other places in magazines, but most of you haven't seen it. So I'm not going to spend much time reading from it. In fact, I'm going to spend no time reading from it. But I'm going to just read you something that at this stage is still new, still happening, and so you're an original audience. And as an original audience, sometimes original audiences suffer. But it's the latest work, and that's the one that's important for me. It's called, it has a title, and it's finished, I think. The title is Separation, a Fable. Other than that, I'll let it speak for itself. And I'm not going to read very long. It won't be more than a couple of pages. But relax, kick back, and listen. When all was darkness, the oldest story in Sumer recalls, there existed no thought of time. Each animal lived alone, and beyond alone nothing. No thought of other animals, no light, no sound, total darkness and silence. No fear of death, no loneliness, all animals one, all free as God. Then one animal imagined time. Time, an explosion of light that revealed sights and sounds of other animals inhabiting darkness, each animal separate, each a blur of clamor, motion, confusion, each stunned, overwhelmed by possibilities of seeing or being seen, by the shock of time's abrupt, mysterious presence that seems to open space where there is none, and takes what seems to be space away. Each animal needing words and time alone to think them, to separate themselves from time, each animal dissolving as fast as time dissolves, time sudden, implacable, invisible, time boundless, yet caged in old darkness that promises nothing, holds nothing. Because I was a child, I was certain that if I stood alone and listened, quiet enough, long enough, beside my grandfather's coffin, he would speak to me. I was just as certain that I had lacked the courage to enter the room alone where they had put the box in which they had put him. I was 10 years old and frightened, speechless by my grandfather's death. The rest of this story is learning. Learning time, learning words, learning not to forget lives I could have lived if I had not been afraid, if I had trusted my grandfather's love, my love of him, if I had entered the room's stink and dark and silence. It could begin in Sumer. First problem, I did not speak nor write the Sumerian language. Today, unfortunately, neither does anyone else. But language, it turns out, a convenience, not a necessity. Often more useless than useful, the second man I encountered in the city of Ar in Sumer assured me as his gaze swept over me, past me, much more than language separates us, his eyes told me. Galaxies swirl in the space between your planet and mine, he said without uttering a single syllable. His silence louder than babble of buying, selling, braying, hallooing, bells, screams of a busy marketplace in the bright, hot middle of a day in which I am a stranger. So much a stranger, I know better than to ask others in this crowd of strangers any question about particulars of place or time, or why they are here, why I am here. My eyes, ears, the entire piecemeal body that I am inside, or it's inside me, or floating just above me, or me floating just above it. Two strangers milling, swelling the crowd, and whatever question I asked, no one could answer because the language here is Sumerian, and I don't speak it, and who does? Sumer, a kingdom once I read about, ancient as counting, ancient as words and writing. Sumer, and I find myself there, and Sumer holds my grandparents' row house. Not their house. They didn't own one, never owned more than a couple sticks, though my grandfather worked hard and drank hard enough year after year from the very first day he arrived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, fresh immigrant from Culpeper, Virginia, to own the entire city where he grew old and died, too poor still after decades of work and drinking gallons of Dago Red, no money for an undertaker to display his dead body after doing what undertakers do to preserve lifeless flesh as a kind of doll in their funeral parlors if surviving family pays cash or owns burial insurance paid in weekly installments to a usually bespectacled, usually white, usually Jewish insurance man whose specialty row house dwellers like my grandparents, collecting nickel by nickel from them weekly for decades if the family could afford to keep up premiums, or if not keep up, beg, as my grandmother told me she did Mr. Cohen, really a nice man. She whispered to me, begged him many a week, then sometimes 2 or 3 empty-handed weeks to grant more time, or more like take pity on her while profusely, sometimes not dry-eyed, she literally begged to the point of almost dropping down to her knees, but he was nice and could see the abjection coming, and a family man himself, so desired no part of it, and let her off with a weary nod as she stood there wavering in her housecoat, him always in my grandfather's easy chair, just inside the front door where he'd settled, crossed one leg over the other, and opened his coupon book first time she let him in the house. Mr. Cohen, nice enough to shut sometimes the book he'd opened and propped on his knee, saying her name sometimes while he slowly wagged his head, a halfway frown, halfway smile. Frida, oh, Frida, letting her off this once or twice or more until she saved the nickel or majority of a series of delinquent nickels, and seated now on a wooden chair, knees pressed together on the piece of furniture furthest from the man, but too close anyway, she counted out coins, rose and delivered them to his palm from a kerchief in her lap she had opened as if opening Fort Knox, the way she might open her lips or legs to a stranger to feed her starving family, then kill herself immediately afterwards, or maybe not the way she opens that same flowered kerchief with its twisted corners and withdraws blood money, a few crumpled bills smelling like talcum powder, and hands them to me. First year I went away to college. But open it she would to pay the insurance man, so family and friends can come to pay their respects in a respectable way, in a respectable place, a living place, scrubbed spotless clean, so nobody tempted to say or think these trifling niggers never own two sticks to rub together. That old man laid out in one of the tiny rooms of a dark, tiny row house, no windows for sun to peek through, dark, stuffy, and cramped as the box the old man winds up in after working hard, drinking hard every day of his life, and to show for it what? Him and Frida in this narrow-ass box of row house, barely large enough to hold two old people, and here come one, his daughters, and her three babies cramped up in there, boarding with them, upset, crying, daily messes all the time, everywhere, and suddenly it's busy, noisy as a Sumer marketplace in the yellowish, shit-brown sand of a desert's vastness because the daughter and kids got no place else to go, nowhere for them in this giant, big, sprawled-out city the grandfather could have bought and sold a couple times over with the fruit of his labor, if there had been fruit instead of just more labor, till the day he died on the toilet in a bathroom too small for him to reach, to stretch out his long shanked legs. They, his long legs I inherited, him wind up laid out in a wooden box with a hinged lid, so the lid's top third could stay open till they shut it down at night. Peace at night from December's last flies in his face in that row house they didn't own, but renting a lifetime, working a lifetime, and after all that, still not a penny for the undertaker's services except the job of draining fluids and pumping in embalming oil or whatever it was in the body after the undertaker fetched it, then brought it back to lie in state in a dark, stuffy little room, because all rooms tiny and dark, except maybe the kitchen a little less so, one small window back there at the row house's rear end, sunlight back there in my grandmother's long, straight, gray hair, light frizzed up in those loose hairs from the bun she kept it tied in while busy back there cooking or cleaning, light floating atop her head back there. If I looked up at her from the Bible days coloring book and crayons on the kitchen table one of my aunts had given me on my birthday or Easter, I think, I remember, but respectable people wouldn't lay out a body in the kitchen, would they? Even if kitchen the brightest room, even if no money to rent a room for 3-4 hours of one day, and other services like programs with photos or sad music piped into a funeral parlor, a certain old-fashioned dignity, maybe after all about the old-time way people down home and immigrants in the North too used to bury people, laying them out in the house they lived in until church, cemetery, a certain familiarity and roundness and appropriateness, even if the dead person didn't own, just rented, just lived there, just occupied the cabin or row house, slept in it as I sleep in my body without owning it, but get habituated to think of the flesh as belonging to me, as Sumer would belong to me, and me to it, while I'm remembering a day in Sumer, beginning to teach myself Sumerian as if it were a language a person in a story might learn to speak in another place and time.
So we're very lucky to have gotten to hear a new story. So throughout much of your work, and the piece that you just read, it seems like there are cycling themes that you stay with. You're most interested in what you're writing right now, but we're still talking about death, time, Black pain, injustice, family, language. Why do you sort of circle these same themes, and how do you make them feel like new stories every time you tell them?
That's a good question. I ask myself often. And when I start new work, I think, well, hey, let's do something about a trapeze artist, or let's do something about something different. But I think for me anyway, that the writing is simply a way to make sense of things. And I keep trying to make sense of things, and I don't know a hell of a lot. And what is most clear and most solid in my mind are the people in my family, the people I grew up with, the places I grew up with. And so when I attempt to make sense of all that, I return to the same material. And that material seems to speak with a sort of clarity and immediacy that I just have to respond to. I don't have a choice. I think I've been a writing teacher for a long, long time. And when my students ask me about subject matter, I think already there's a problem. Because the subject matter isn't something that you find on a shelf or in an anthology that has a subject matter index in it. It's who you are. It's what you have been. It's what's made you what you are.
So I'm going to quote you back to you. You were interviewed recently, or not recently, actually, it was quite a while ago, for the Paris Review. And you said the stories also changed as I got older. They got bawdier, they got raunchier. Sometimes they just changed because people changed. You're talking about your family, telling stories and learning how to tell stories from listening to them. And part of what would happen is that other people would add little bits and pieces to the story, or they would amen it, or somebody would say, well, that's not the way it was. What really happened was X, Y, and Z, and you'd get competing versions, and it became like dueling banjos. People would try to out-talk or over-talk or loud-talk one another. And I thought that that was really interesting because if you look at your work from when you started 22 books ago.
That many?
Versus right now, it's the same story, just like a family tale might be the same story. Auntie such and such did this thing. And then 20 years later, it's filled in with all these other bits. And your stories revolving around the same subject matter in many ways, or doing the same thing. How do you feel like your stories have changed being older now from when you started?
Well, one thing that happens when you involve yourself in any kind of art or sport or a love affair, you accumulate experience. And as you accumulate that experience, you learn more about what you are involved in. And I think if you're lucky, whatever you learn makes you want to come back or continue it. And I think that's what has happened for me. And it's not a coincidence that in a way in my family, I don't know about yours, there was a real competitiveness about these oral sessions, these storytelling sessions. And they were not formal, it just happened. At the end of church, people would, well, what do you do next? Well, you go home and you kind of undress and you get ready to go wherever you're going to go after that, or maybe there's a church event, and the people gather. And what do? You don't turn on the TV. People didn't individually, each one turn on their phone or their iPad and go off into that kind of monologue, soliloquy, whatever you want to call that sort of communication. So we were kind of entertaining each other. But there was always an edge because you had to earn a spot in the communal discourse. And earning that meant skill. In the same way, if you wanted to play basketball in certain courts, on certain courts in my neighborhood, you just didn't walk in and say, duh, my turn, I have winners. You had to, well, you could do that. That's why it was the purest democracy you can imagine. Anybody had a right to do that. But if you were stupid enough to do that and you could not play, then you were very quickly embarrassed, and people ran your ass off the court, and you would never make that mistake again, or you would get your game together before that. And so, but it was pure democracy, and people could enter or leave. And that chorus of voices, and someone leading the chorus, and speaking to the chorus, and the chorus speaking back to them, that was, for me, a kind of paradigm. And it still is, for how literature should work. Because for me, if I'm not speaking to my reader in a sense that I'm giving the reader a chance to answer me, then the writing's not working for me. I want to hear back from my readers. This piece I read to get us started, it's called Separation. So it's kind of perverse, because it's, the word itself means distance, lack of connection. And then the subtitle's fable, because I think in any art or any game, you have to have, it involves rules. And without those rules, the game dissolves. But the point of the rules is that they're consensual, they're communal, we work together. It's just the opposite of empire. We are born into an empire, and it's worth our lives, worth our livelihood, and et cetera, our family. We have to play by the rules of the empire, and all of us, to some degree, have to do that, beginning with language. Do you speak Sumerian? Can you tell your story in Sumerian? Is that the going language here? But I think as a writer and as an intellectual and just a citizen, you find out there is no language. That it's that the language is all these separate occasions when folks get together and say what they want to say to one another. And that's the language, the many languages.
So, you're talking about having this relationship with the reader. And how do you experience that relationship with the reader? Like, how do you know that you are in conversation with an audience?
That the sentences don't fall flat. They don't fall, they're not dead.
Right.
They're not dead on the page. When I go back to revise, and I do most of my work in terms of revision. I love it. The raw writing, the stuff that comes out first, I'm never exactly in control of when that's going to happen or why that happens. And so that's why I can't tell my students what they should write about. That there's an unconscious business. Those ghosts that are floating around in one's head, and those voices that you've heard before. And they kind of dictate what stuff is worth writing about. So when I'm writing that first, when I'm lucky enough to be visited by whatever you want to call it, the muses, by fear, by family, by whatever, the way that comes at me is an invitation to commence a dialogue. And I'm pretty sure when I begin to write, whether or not I'm speaking to those voices that have been kind enough to visit me. I can't control who's there, when they're there, but once I hear them, I have taught myself the ability to learn the register. Are they speaking in a way like people spoke in the 18th century novels I read in Oxford? Do I hear Samuel Richardson and Fielding and Sterne, Lawrence Stern in that raw stuff that just comes to me, that I find myself in position. Am I hearing those sort of voices? Then I better remember those cadences, those long sentences, those balanced periods, that vocabulary, because that's where this stuff is happening, that universe of language. And it can be just as easily that universe of language as the universe of language in Homewood AME Church.
Right.
And it doesn't matter, because as I said, I don't command the voices to begin to speak to me. When I'm lucky, they come.
Right. And how do you feel like, so, I'm back to that idea of the reader. This is very heady, complex, beautiful, but very challenging work that you do. It is.
Yes.
And you're talking also about things that, as a Black woman, right, like are important to me. You're talking about injustice. You're talking about race. You're talking about the myth of color. You're talking about all these things that are part of our conversation. How do you think a reader can access that? Who do you think is accessing that? Who do you hope reads it, and how do you hope they read it?
My hopes are very high, because I try to set a high bar for myself. And so I'm hoping there's somebody who wants to play the same game. When I went to the playground to play basketball in Pittsburgh, I purposely went where the games were the best. And even when I went away to college and then went back to Pittsburgh or in Philadelphia, I sought out the best players. Sometimes that meant I got embarrassed. Sometimes I was in over my head. But not to play at that level just didn't have much meaning for me. It was all about aspirations. It wasn't about certainty. It wasn't thinking that I was going to be better than those other people at some point, although I think I really did need to believe that in the innocence, childish innocence, and the innocence of athletics. You start a game in which there are benefits to the winner, and plaudits and laurels go to the winner. You enter that because you think you're going to win, not because you think you're going to lose. Right. So there's an innocence involved in that, and I attribute that not to me, but to anybody who plays games, anybody who is competitive. There's something you want to do that's worth winning, and you're willing to take an ass kicking maybe if you don't. But the aspiration, and I can't help but write about subjects that are address the fact that where I grew up, most people didn't have anything like the chances to go other places in the world, financially, geographically, intellectually, that I did. And so they're with me. I'm also, I never left that place. I can't leave that place. So that's, I hope, why it speaks when the writing is at its best. They're with me, and so we're speaking, or I'm trying to find the language that connects us.
And so, what hope do you have for, what do you want people to take away from it? Like, what do you want me, random reader, person that loves your work and picks it up and learns something, what do you want me to learn from, sort of the body of your work? And I'm going to start asking you about your age in a minute, so forgive me.
I want you to learn to tell your own stories, because writing doesn't own the process of storytelling, making up a world. Writing doesn't own it at all. You have a chance to make up a world every time you wake up in the morning. Right. And in fact, you have no choice. I mean, what are we all doing here? What is this about? What it's kind of parenthesis. It's an evening out, a literary evening out. You hear John Wideman, you hear Lisa Lucas, you're in this great institution that is looking out for people who have troubles and who have been thrown a curveball by life, and this is an institution dedicated to somehow helping them, and that's all part of the context, and you know that. Some of you know it, others couldn't care less. You may have just been walking down the street, saw the sign, and popped in. So, but then you begin to make something of it. Who is this dude on the stage? What is he saying? How's it connect with me? So I want my readers, my people who encounter my fiction, to be able to tell their own stories. Because again, that's that reciprocity I'm looking for. So I hope I'm being consistent, but I want you not only to tell your story, but specifically, if you are an African American, and sooner or later, usually pretty quickly, you know that I have a very specific cultural background. I want you to feel, as I do, that the language belongs to you. Not just the vernacular, not just the kind of street slang and whatever that pops up here and there, but that you own the language and you control the language, and it belongs to you as much as anybody else. That's why I'm hoping to teach people. I'm hoping to suggest that people can be storytellers.
In a profile of you, Imani Perry was mentioning that the conversation around race in the country is largely dominated by younger voices these days, or it feels like it might be, whether it's literary or otherwise. And so does that make you feel like you have something more to say? She was saying that it's particularly wonderful to hear from somebody in their 70s, given that. But do you think that you have something different to say? I mean, obviously, people that started writing when you started, there were less, empowered young Black writers. There were less people with the same opportunities. And so having, sort of gone through that full time, in a way that many haven't, do you think that there's something that you want to say to the next generation of young writers? Is there something that you want to say with your fiction and your nonfiction, or the hybrid sort of blend of all of it?
I taught writing for 40-some years, and so I have an interest in what younger writers are doing and thinking. But I don't think of it, I seldom think of it as a sort of age business. I say what I have to say. If you want to listen, fine. If you don't listen, fine. I'm not in it to impress you. I'm not in it to connect the generations. I'm in it because it's something I have to do. And for my own reasons, I try to do it very well. And that is the primary connection. The fact that we share a language, the fact that we are implicated by the terrible things that this empire is doing every day. And if some younger writers see in my work or in my example something is going to help them break their way out of this, what seems very much like an impasse sometimes, socially and economically, and the whole issue of race, well, so be it, and I hope it works. But I don't necessarily have much faith that that's going to happen. Because, why? Because, again, the language that I want to share with you and want to provoke you into feeling it belongs to you. And I'm just using you because you're a younger person, much younger than I am. That language is freighted, weighted down by centuries of words like race, like black and white, like male and female, like young and old. And to be an educated person means you've been a slave. You've been enslaved in a very real way by the presumptions and assumptions of that language. So how do you then move forward, liberate yourself from that weight? That's the problem we all have. And that's why we create the world anew, I think. That's why it's so important to create it anew and create the language anew. Or at least believe we do. At least believe we have the power to do that. And that's all I think my that's the importance my example carries. You can like Wideman's writing or not like it. He can be your favorite or not, but he did do something. He did publish these books, and there are a lot of them, and some people read them, and most people don't. But he could do that. He did do that, and that means something.
I'm always offended by people calling books meditations, because they just use it for everything. It's like, this is a meditation on this is a meditation on that. But your books are actually, in many ways, meditations. You're speaking to
Thank you.
Yes, in a beautiful way. It's like, it's not annoying when it's appropriately applied. But you're speaking to yourself. So it's like moving away from sort of that impact on the world and moving into like the impact on you. You've talked about having to write and about trying to figure out how to, sort of create the world anew. That process of sort of talking to yourself and inserting yourself and playing with the world and time and, the double entry of time is one of the things you meant that's in the epigraph from the Thomas Mann, Dr. Faustus epigraph. How does this all change you? Like, how has it impacted you over the time that you've been doing this practice of kind of going in and telling a story and inserting your understanding of the world, your history, on top of the political world that we live in, on top of the fake world that we live in?
What's it done for me? Well, it's kept me going. I feel like I'm an extraordinarily lucky person. I've done basically what I wanted to do for a whole lot of years, for most of my life. And I wish that many of the ideas or crusades that I've embarked on and talked about in my books, I wish I would have had more success. For instance, I wrote Brothers and Keepers, which it's already a book is 30 years old now, but it's about the prison crisis, a crisis of prisons. And at that time, there were maybe, 300,000 prisoners. Now we have 2.5 million. So, and at that time, in my romantic, innocent soul, I had heard a story about Leadbelly and how Leadbelly, who was a prisoner in Louisiana, played music and the warden heard it, or the stupid governor heard it, somebody heard it, and they just got him out of prison because that boy can sing. Shouldn't be in prison. He can sing, And Leadbelly went on to have a career. In my mind, I thought if I wrote a really good book about my brother, that somehow that would help to get him out of prison. And that was very, very clearly a major motivation. Now here we are, all these years later. That book was published, 85, something like that. And he's still in. He applied for a parole 3 years ago. The Board of Pardons and Parole take that long to consider the simple request for a hearing in front of the board. Now, that ain't progress, and he's not out here, and I could give you many, many more examples. But you keep trying, keep doing what you need to do. And yes, I'm terribly, terribly disappointed, but on the other hand, I haven't given up, and I have not been quiet about it all. And so to see Michelle Alexander write about the new Jim Crow, to see that more and more countries and people are worried about prisoners, to have more books written by prisoners, to see the connections that have been made between slavery and men in prison, to all that. The statistics many of you could quote now, the ones who are enlightened about prisons and about minority overrepresentation in prisons. That stuff that's sort of available to you now was not available before. So something's happened. Something's going on. Now, where it will lead us, I think it leads to heartbreak most of the time, because whatever progress is made, there's one step forward, 2 steps back, and we are on the brink of allowing ourselves to become imprisoned by the dictates of an empire again. We're as close to that as we are to another kind of fantastic leap forward and liberation.
So this is not a super joyful book. But there are moments of hope in it. You know, it's like it felt like there were moments where you talk about love, for instance, quite tenderly, and it starts with a kind of aspiration, right? You write a letter to the president.
Assuming he could read.
Or she.
Or she.
There's a tense change at the, or there's a change at the end. It begins, dear sir, dear Mr. President, and then at the end, it could be a woman.
She could read, probably.
What would happen if a president read this book? What do you think? You know, what would you imagine to be the outcome if a president sat down and said, "I've been written this letter, and I've been sent this book, and I'm going to read it"? What would you anticipate the reaction would be?
Well, obviously, it would depend on the president, but I would hope that this chief executive would say, "Well, that's some weird stuff. That's not what I see every day. That's not what I read every day. It looks a little bit different. Who is this guy? Who are these people?" I would hope to make a small noise, not necessarily acceptable, not necessarily happy, but hey, there's something out there that is not part of what I see as my job. I usually see as my job, as my constituency. There is some level of discontent, or there is some level of critique, and it still has a voice. Maybe I'll pass this on to one of my aides. Maybe I'll, whatever. That would be an ideal reaction. But what I think would happen is probably the first difficult sentence or the first complicated idea or the lack of a plot would as most readers, turn a chief executive off. And they say, "This is not fiction. This is not, what is this shit?" And they would put it down, and that would be fine.
But what does that say about us that we can't receive fiction? We can't receive challenging, complicated work. You know, it's like, I think that was what I was trying to get at earlier, which is that, you know, we want to be able to, like, we're all very complicated. You know, you can read even if I don't understand what a story is. Sometimes I don't. There's a line that just reminds me of who I am and where I sit in the world, you know? And there's a thing that I can connect my fundamental humanity back to. But what does it mean when we live in a world where our politicians and just people, just ordinary people, can't connect to that basic, you know, sort of human communication because it is complicated or it's philosophical or it's...
Well, there's a lot of separation, and to say the least. And we're frightened of one another. We're extremely, extremely frightened of one another. And I would consider my writing a gift. It's a gift to me that I'm able to do it. And when I finish a book or an essay or a story, I just put it out there as a gift. People can take it or not. I hope some take it and enjoy it, but it is a gift. Human beings are creatures that are, as much as you or I can be happy about receiving something and wishing to receive a gift, we're also frightened by gifts. Right. Because it's suddenly the gift opens up a two-way street. Where is it coming from? How am I obligated? If I kiss this guy, you know, if I touch this woman, what's going to happen next? And we're frightened of gifts. And we're frightened of gifts because we have not evolved a kind of life which gives us room for surprises. Surprises have a dark side. And the piece that I began by reading tonight, I think it kind of attempts to epitomize this notion that we all are in the dark, and that the knowledge that there are other creatures beyond us is wonderful, but it's also quite frightening. And a gift, a language, words, poems, whatever, are an acknowledgement that we're not alone. And most of us need to be alone because we want it our way. We want it our way.
So, sort of pivoting to something a little bit different, the history that's layered underneath these stories. You invoke Romare Bearden, Frederick Douglass, John Brown, Basquiat, Sonny Rollins, you know, all of these enormous sort of group of people. Why do you bring them forth? Why do we need to read about them within these stories? And what does history mean to this, you know, to this writing enterprise of yours?
What I hope to do, what I'd love to do, is to make these lives absolutely synonymous, or suggest that they're the same stuff as Lisa's life, as John's life, as your life. To say the things about a Basquiat, or say those things about a John Brown, that make it clear that they don't exist in some other ether. They don't exist in some, those lives don't exist in another time or another place. They're here, now. They are the fable. They are the material of the fable which we create about ourselves. And that kind of fluidity and interpenetration and sharing of stuff is what I hope to do with this sort of melange and this sort of achronicity, and bringing up the notion of the empire of Sumer, where writing and civilization sort of begins. And is it off somewhere in space, or was it the same place I grew up in Pittsburgh? Right. And the answer is yes and no.
And the struggle is the same for many of these folks. The struggle doesn't change. You know, in the first chapter, the letter to the president, you mentioned that, like, slavery will never end. There's two people left, I'm paraphrasing poorly, that are too weak to enslave one another.
I tend to believe that. But there are a lot of things between two people who are kind of looking at each other and lose the desire to rule one another. There's a lot of space between that and slavery as we know it in the American South in the beginning in the 16th century. There's a lot of space. There's a lot of ways that people related to one another. That's in either extreme. So that's the space I'd like to explore. That's the fable. The fable is we can do anything. We can go to the moon. We can fly. We can live underwater. Maybe cure cancer. We can do anything. That's the fable. That's the myth. But we're saddled with mortality. We're saddled with our own despicable selfishness and angers at others and prejudices towards others. So how does all that work together? Well, it works together for you and your life the same way it worked for John Brown, and the same way it worked for a collagist like Bearden, the same way it works for Basquiat, I believe.
Do you feel like So mortality is also a thing that comes up a lot in this book. It feels like, and maybe I'm just reading into it.
No. I'm very grateful to your thoughtfulness and the way you keep turning to the books. It helps me talk about them, so I'm not just floating around in some I hope not floating around in some very private ether. So,
No.
You know.
Is it hard to sort of start interrogating that idea with your work? You always have, but to look at it, from a different perspective, from like an elder statesperson perspective, let's call it.
I think the question always is the sentence. Mm-hmm. It's always the immediacy of the work, which is a salvation. Mm-hmm. You can go into a basketball game, a playground game or college game, and you can have a game plan. Mm-hmm. And it can be very solid and make a lot of sense. Your team's faster than the other guy, so you want to speed the game up. But you either win or lose based on the minutia. Mm-hmm. Right. I fake right. Do you go for the fake, or are you right there in defending me again? So I can't go to the hoop, and then that gives somebody over there a chance to come over, and suddenly I'm double teamed, and that fake, in fact, slows the game down, and now you're in control. Now I fake again. Do you go for that fake, or you
That's
recover?
more than I've ever known about basketball in my entire life.
Did
you see my face? I was like, yes.
Yeah. But that's it. It's the minutia. And with writing, it's sentence by sentence, word by word. Mm-hmm. You can kill 50 readers with the wrong word. You just knock them out, just chase them away with the wrong word at the wrong time. Mm-hmm. And so and that's the beauty of it at the same time. I know my brain, my thinking, my memories are not as agile as they once were, and I don't have that kind of.
They're pretty agile.
I don't have that kind of those resources that I feel I once had. It's like I couldn't play a game of basketball, but I do recognize the situations, and I've been there before, and I still get excitement trying to improvise and make sense of whatever gifts I have in those situations. And that's why old heads sometimes win a game they should not win when they're playing very young, talented people, because they're going back to the roots, to the source, to what the game's all about.
So I have one more. I think we'll ask questions from should we do questions from the audience now? We can do one more. Okay, so I just want to turn back finally to that idea, and this is, again, I'm moving all over the place, so forgive me, but just about the myth of color, the myth of race, which comes back again and again, and sort of, for me, like, connects to this sort of idea that we are all the same, we are all living in time, we are all living in our bodies, and, it's like this is this big, it's more constructed than a mishmash, but it's like all living together, history, the present, you, the reader, the writer, all of it's happening at one time. But it's a complicated idea, right? Like the idea that color is fake. Right, that it's something that we've made up, even though it's very simple. But it's also, I think, the extreme distance to which you take the idea of color not being a thing competes with, I think, the way that we think about race in America right now. And so do you feel like it's challenging to sort of, I suspect you don't, to put forth a very out-of-the-box way of thinking about race? Certain lines would, I cannot imagine another person saying them. Very unclear question. Forgive me.
No, it's a question that will never go.
We'll call it a prompt.
No, it will never go away. It will never go away. And I've heard it asked by very, very, very smart people in many different ways. But okay, can we just say, I love you. Mm-hmm. I don't care what color you are. I don't care, bridge of your nose, your lips, your what continent you came from. It's just, we're people. We're all people. That's a fable. That's a myth. Mm-hmm. You can spin that out. You can believe in it if you want to. And it's nice,
Right.
but you better not let anybody know, certain people know that you think that, and you believe that, or else your ass is grass. You're an enemy. You're risking life and limb. I would start, if I had to make one discrimination, even before color, the discrimination I would make would be power. That power sets the table. Power means that we have black people and white people in America. And whether I believe that, no matter how I parse that, power means at one level, at a very basic level, there are black and white people. That's the way it's set up. You can't get around it. That's what we have to deal with. And how you create counterpower, how you get around that division, that's what I'm working on. That's my life. That's what I am. That's what makes me keep going. I realize how terrible that divisiveness, that absolute divisiveness is. I know the cost of it in my family, in my friends, in my country. And so I keep working to create some sort of power that's a counterpower to that absolute distinction. It doesn't make the distinction go away,
Right.
but it's that's what
That's
I
the
don't know
work.
what else to do.
It's the work.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that messy question, but it was a great answer. How about we take some questions from the audience?
We have time for
Three
three.
questions.
Questions, not statements, questions.
Yes.
You've been instructed. I don't
Yeah,
know,
that's
you
always
know
the worst, in case anybody didn't know that that's the worst.
Sir.
My friend's father and stuff used to be, take Josephine Baker back and forth across the Atlantic, and he was a piano player, and they were her accountant. And just the stories about Josephine Baker and when she'd come back here to America and be treated as a second-class citizen, but when she would go in Paris, she was a star. I was just wondering why would you want to come back, or if there's places that was more equitable, that why would you continue to stay in a country so, I don't know, racially divided? And I wonder about her, why she would keep coming back if Paris kind of offered her, freedom from that kind of.
Oh, it's a good question. You know the answer?
Well,
No, and I think that we'd have to consult her. And I think maybe that's a story you could write. And maybe in the story there'd be a character like you or like your dad or like who would ask her that question. And you could throw out an answer. And if you're a good writer, then maybe your readers, the people who read that story, would begin to wonder and ask themselves why anybody would want to come back. Somebody else could answer that question or formulate an answer to that question and say, well, if you don't like it, get the hell out. And that's another reaction to your question. That's another way. That's another direction that it goes. Well, if the United States was so awful, why would she come back? Is she nuts? And if she doesn't like it here, why don't you just stay in France? So it all depends on how you take these facts and these choices that are given by the state of this particular empire and the history of this empire. We are all responsible, like I'm responsible sentence by sentence for my writing. You're responsible for figuring these things out. Getting a machine inside your head or music inside your head that helps you do that. Why do people get out of sick bed? if they know they're, most likely they're going to get sick again, or they have some sort of disease that's going to just crop up again. But people work real hard to try to get better. Shouldn't they just, it ain't going to get better.
Well, I think I would always try to escape the hospital. That's where sick people are.
How about another?
I have a very mundane question, but how do you set your discipline? How do you decide how many hours, or you certainly have a routine of the day? I always admire how you can be, how any writer can be in his or her head. And, you know, how do you do it?
Habit, and just set rules.
That's what I was wondering, so,
Yeah, I hate rules,
yeah.
and I hate habit. And if I have to sweep a floor, small floor, not even a floor that's very dirty, I can't do it systematically, up, back, up, back. I find myself doing a diagonal, dancing a little bit with the, I just can't stand it. So, knowing that, I get up every morning, I have done this for many, many decades, and pin myself in the bed or to a chair, and know that I don't allow anything to interfere with that. Now, I may not accomplish much writing in that time, and I may resent the whole deal, and by the end of the week, I may go out and get loaded for 3 days, but still, the discipline, in the same way I discipline myself to shoot a jump shot. You have to do it many times a day. You have to be aware each time you do it. You have to be aware of, you have to set aside the time to do it, the practice. That's what I've managed to do. And I've been very lucky, because I could earn a living and still maintain that schedule. But even when I was a student, an undergraduate, a student in college, I made sure that I didn't take classes before a certain time, because I wanted to have that time for writing, or thinking about writing, or reading about writing, or rereading. So for as long as I can remember, I've set aside that time. And it was just a decision that I made and lived with it. That's the simple answer.
One last one.
In, I think it was the Paris Review interview, you mentioned something about not, though you said you're a competitive person, not really trying to fight to be the best writer in a genre or in a room at any time, and you weren't concerned about that. And I'm wondering, and not even the intellectual competition, but more so social. I feel like we're in a time where there's a lot of social competition for writers. What do you think that does to the writing, or what have you seen it do to the writing?
My ears are terrible, but the acoustics coming out of that. Could you say that?
I think it was that you were saying that, I can repeat it. So you were saying in the Paris Review article that you're not like socially competitive as a writer, right? Like you're competing with yourself to do the best writing. And she's asking, like, in a climate where everybody is, or many writers are socially competitive, what does that do to the writing? Like, does it harm it? What does that change about the way that the writing community looks? Yeah?
I think it's very, very detrimental, because it means that forces that don't have the interests of the writing at heart are in fact determining an awful lot about who gets read and who doesn't read, and et cetera, et cetera. In other words, it's the empire again. And it's very tough for a writer, because a young writer, you shouldn't have too many readers too soon. That's kind of a dumb thing to say, because you could have lots of readers very soon and make a lot of money and learn something, and your writing could become better, or you just disappear and become a talk show host or whatever. You can't, it's a case-by-case thing, but the competitiveness, why would you want to be on the front page of the Times? Well, obviously you want to be on the front page of the Times when your book comes out. But really, why do you want to be on the front page of the Times? And what do you believe that tells you about yourself? And what does that tell you about writing in general? And what does it tell you about the quality of your writing? And what's it tell you about the quality of the writing around you? And what is represented by that kind of popularity and achievement? For all the good and fun that a movie like the Black Panther might create, and won't go too deeply into that. But on the other hand, could you deny that when people, a group of people, say 500, go into a theater, when they come out, do you believe, I believe, that the notion of race has been more deeply embedded and inscribed in those spectators than it was before they went in. And so whatever else the movie does, it has reinforced the most destructive, divisive concept in our society, race.
Well, thank you for your generosity in your writing and your ornery, wonderfully ornery mind.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. Get to gush as much as you want in this situation. Thank you.
Thank you for coming out.
Please do pick up a copy of this book. And please do pick up all of the books. Truly,